So we left off A World in Flames with the United States joining the war effort thanks to the Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor. If Japan had not directly attacked the United States, it probably would have taken a lot longer for the United States to enter the war, and they certainly would not have entered the war with the same enthusiasm and united front that they actually did. So let's look at that united front. The American home front, which is all of the supporters of the war, the civilians back in the United States, was a united front. We remember we are still in the Great Depression, and entering World War II for the United States will be the crucial factor in bringing the United States out of the Great Depression. Once again, we have the factories moving, and we have a demand for production. Remember, that was one of the problems of the Great Depression. The ability to produce was great, but the demand was not. Now we have a massive demand for all material necessary for the war, and all goods, even normal consumer goods, that will then be used by the military. So we have American civilians promoting and supporting the war by rationing food and items, allowing the military to use them, planting what we call victory gardens, which in other words means a garden in your backyard so that you eat food from your backyard, and the food that's produced massively can be sent for the military. We have the famous hidden army of women in industrial America. Even more than in World War I, the American woman is utilized and valued for her contribution to the war effort. American women will make up the majority of the force of labor that will be producing all of the tanks, planes, ships, guns, munitions for the war effort, allowing the men to go and serve in the war. Actually, in the Air Force industry, I've written here, women made up 65% of the labor force. Not only the American public, but the American media will join the promotion of the war effort. So the Office of War Information is actually an institution created by the government in order to oversee the propaganda campaign in every way. So radios, film production, news reporting, literature, the visual arts, everything is going to be promoting the war effort, showing a positive spirit and promoting patriotism. It's a great thing to go to war. We're going to go and we're going to defeat these bad, evil empires, which would be the Empire of Japan and the Third Reich in Europe. And so these are evil things that we need to overthrow. And so this distinction of good and evil, this positive spirit of joining the forces and trying to overcome this evil, and the fact that we are going to be successful with this massive positivism, it's also going to be supported by Hollywood and Disney, who both fully support the war effort. They're going to be cranking out, in other words, creating tons and tons of films during this time period that are all focused on the war and the war effort. This is in stark comparison to the media influence during the Vietnam War, which we will also be touching later on, where the media did not support the war and displayed a very negative vision of the war, and that will have its incredible impact on the war effort as well. So this positivism was very much a large contribution to the successful execution of the war. But not only in the propaganda area and in the civilian support, but most importantly, industry is in support of the war. The American car industry will be the most important industry that makes the war successful. We remember Henry Ford had his Model T that he had produced. Well, At this point, everybody has a Model T, or they can't afford a Model T because they are in the Great Depression and they had to sell their Model T so they could feed their family. Well, now Ford uses his mass production and his assembly line production to start building B-24 Liberators, which are huge airplanes, bombers that are used in Europe and the Pacific. Pontiac, another car industry, creates anti-aircraft guns. Chrysler will create the Detroit Arsenal tank plant, and their company alone will build more tanks than all of Germany during all the year wars. So just one American car company will build more tanks than all of the Third Reich. Henry Kaiser starts building ships for the war effort, and he goes from building civilian cargo ships in 244 days, about 2/3 of a year, to applying the mass production techniques and cranking out a military ship in 41 days, so just a little over a month. They will also be very inventive, and they will come up with new types of vehicles. The amphibious duck truck is the most important, especially for the sea invasions in the Pacific, and it's designed by General Motors. It can operate both on the water and on land, so it goes from being a ship to a car, basically, kind of like a frog can go from the water, swimming in the water, to hopping on land. So this is the amphibious duck truck. And then GM, most importantly, they will outproduce all of Germany and Japan's production efforts, and no other corporation anywhere at any time in history ever did more to support a war effort. So General Motors is very influential in helping the American war effort. So what happens? After Pearl Harbor, almost immediately after Pearl Harbor, the Japanese attack the Philippines. We remember that the Philippines are still a territory of the United States since the Spanish-American War. So there are American citizens living in the Philippines, and there is the presence of the American military that is protecting the Philippines in collaboration with Philippine soldiers. So the Japanese attack the Philippines as a stronghold of American presence in the Pacific, and they capture Manila, which is the capital, forcing the American and Filipino troops to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. There's a long, drawn-out campaign, and eventually about 75,000 Americans and Filipinos have to surrender to the Japanese because they are not getting any support yet from the United States. Remember, the United States has suffered a serious blow at Pearl Harbor to her Pacific Fleet. Also, America was not prepared to enter World War II. The Americans were thinking about coming in on the side of the Allies, but still had not decided. Popular opinion had not been turned completely to entering the war, so there had not been major war preparations in place. Now the United States had to very quickly increase its military and rebuild its navy for the Pacific, and so did not have enough time to get substantial support to the Philippines. These Filipinos and Americans who had to surrender were then forced to march 65 miles through terrible swamps and jungles in intense heat, subject to diseases and cruel treatment by the Japanese. They were not given water, and they died of dehydration and starvation along the way. So this terrible march that they were forced to undergo to get them to the prison camp, thousands of them died on the way, and this is famously known as the Bataan Death March. The last stronghold to hold out was at Corregidor, and they held out for a little longer under General Wainwright, but they too eventually capitulated, and the Japanese took over all of the Philippines, placing thousands of Americans in their prisoner of war camps, which were held under very cruel conditions. So this is the fall of the Philippines. Now, in retaliation, the United States, in hopes of boosting American morale and of crushing Japanese morale and making them fear the United States, they decided to carry out a very daring bombing campaign against the mainland of Japan. Now, in order to carry significant bombs over a large territory, they needed to use massive bombers. Usually massive bombers, the B-52 or the B-25s, the B-24s, have to take off from land because they're so huge. But there would be no way, there was no land territory that the United States held that was near Japan. So they would have to take off from American carriers, aircraft carriers. Unfortunately, they're so large that they cannot land on an American aircraft carrier. So they took off from the carriers, they flew over Japan, they dropped their bombs on Japan, and then they had to land in China. China at this moment was at war with Japan as well, and therefore was an ally of the United States. So they were going to be landing in China, but it was also occupied territory by the Japanese. So it was very risky for the pilots, and many of them were captured by the Japanese. This would be later repeated in 1945, the same tactic, except they would take off with B-29 bombers from Saipan and Tinian, and they bombed Tokyo and the surrounding areas, flying as low as 500 feet, and this created one of the worst firestorms in history throughout Tokyo with these firebombs that they dropped. This whole tactic of bombing cities during World War II was a tactic used by both sides during the war. They claimed to be attacking tactical support centers and industrial centers where there were shadow factories producing war materials, and they hoped to strike a blow, psychological blow, on the morale of the enemy in doing so. But the idea was to attack military support bases or infrastructure for communications and transportation. In doing so, obviously, they killed thousands and thousands and hundreds of thousands of civilians. So it's definitely not a moral tactic, but it was used by both sides during the war and has since been condemned. Now, the Battle of the Coral Sea. After taking the Philippines, which we see here, the Philippines, which is closer to Japan, Japan is trying to take over more territory in the Pacific, and they head towards New Guinea and the area around New Guinea with all of its islands called the Coral Sea. So this is the Coral Sea area. And the United States intercepts the Japanese attempt to take over these islands, and this is the first air-sea battle in history. The new method of warfare during World War I was using submarines in the naval warfare category, while during World War II, the new method of warfare was to use aircraft carriers and to use airplanes. And here, with the Battle of the Coral Sea, we have the first air-sea battle in history. So the Americans and the Japanese attack each other, sending their airplanes from their aircraft carriers to bomb and torpedo the other's fleet. Now, neither side really won this battle. Both sides suffered severe damage to their fleet. But the important consequence was that it really struck a blow to the Japanese fleet, enough so that they were not able to support their attack of Port Moresby in the taking over of New Guinea. So it really crippled them in their invasion of New Guinea, and then also it crippled their fleet enough so that later in the Battle of Midway, they would not have enough carriers to overpower the American forces. And the Battle of Midway will be very important in the Pacific front, in the Pacific arena of the war. So the consequence of the Coral Sea will be the damage suffered by the Japanese, and therefore crippling their efforts to invade New Guinea, and their success, it will cause their lack of success in the Battle of Midway. Something interesting with regard to the Pacific Front. In every war, it's important to be able to communicate with your allies and with your own soldiers in such a way that the enemy cannot understand the communications being sent. And obviously during World War II, they are communicating over radio waves. So both sides can listen to each other, and the important thing is that you have a code that the other cannot understand or break. The United States used Navajo Indians to create a code that was never broken by the Japanese. The Navajo Indian language is a very complex language. Matter of fact, depending upon how you pronounce the Navajo word, it can have 4 distinct meanings. Also, the language was never a written language, so they had to create their own alphabet. They were speaking their language even though they had created a code from that language, so the deciphering of the code was very quick because you're using the brain of the Navajo Indian to understand his own language. So it was a very quick and efficient method of communication, and the language is not related to any other language that we know of in the world. So it's a very distinct language. And the Japanese were never able to break this code. So Navajo Indians were recruited to be code talkers, and they were very important for the military, so they were very much protected. The code talkers of your unit had to be protected at all costs. They also had an advantage and disadvantage of looking very much like the Japanese. Remember, Native Americans came across the Bering Straits through Alaska down into the New World thousands and thousands of years ago. So they actually come from Asia, and they therefore look very Asian in their aspect. So they have eyes that are more slanted and more thin, and they also have darker skin. So if you put a Navajo Indian in a Japanese uniform, it would be very difficult for the Japanese themselves to distinguish them from a Japanese soldier. And so they were easily able to infiltrate the Japanese lines, but at the same time, this could be a disadvantage because also Americans could accidentally kill their own Navajo soldiers. So it was kind of an advantage and a disadvantage, this looking very much like the Japanese. But this is an important aspect in the war in the Pacific because America was able to effectively communicate without their code ever being broken. In Europe, we famously know about the Enigma, and I think there's a film still on Netflix about the Enigma of the Germans and the war effort, especially by the British with their allies, to break the Enigma code, which they eventually did, and that was significant in the winning of the war in Europe. So, the Battle of Midway, which I had mentioned when we were talking about the Battle of the Coral Sea. So the Battle of the Coral Sea was down here. The Japanese lost a lot of their ships and a lot of their planes down in the Battle of the Coral Sea, so they had fewer planes and ships for the Battle of Midway. The Battle of Midway is probably the most important battle in the Pacific Front. It is the turning point in the war in the Pacific for the United States. The Japanese decided they wanted to attack Midway because it was halfway, which is Midway, halfway between Japan and the United States, so the California coast. It's also very strategically placed to be very close to Hawaii, and so would be a good touch-off point to attack Hawaii. And they send first a fleet, or part of the fleet, up to the Aleutian Islands. Remember, we talked about the strategic importance of Alaska. Well, this is part of Alaska up here, and these are the Aleutian Islands, which are the tip of Alaska, where we had military bases. So they send a part of the fleet up to the Aleutian Islands, in order to trick the Americans into thinking that that was the main fleet and the main objective of the Japanese attack. The Americans knew this was not the case because the Americans had already broken the Japanese code, and they knew that they were planning a massive attack. They suspected that this attack was going to be at Midway. They wanted to confirm this, and so on the regular radio transmissions that are not in Navajo code, they sent out a message to the American fleet saying, a false message to the American fleet, saying that the freshwater supply on the island of Midway was having problems and there were difficulties. Almost immediately afterwards, the Japanese sent in code their communications to their fleet that the island X was having freshwater problems. So they knew that the island X, which was the island that was the object of the attack, was in fact Midway. So the Americans were prepared. They sent their massive fleet to Midway to wait for the Japanese. The Japanese arrive, they send their first wave of planes to bomb Midway, and they are met by American planes. So there is immediately a battle in the air over Midway, and Midway is not significantly damaged in any way. The Japanese planes go back to their aircraft carriers, and in the process they see some American ships, including the USS Yorktown, which is an American aircraft carrier. So they realize that there's some American ships nearby, and so they decide, okay, we need to first wipe out any American ships that are here so that then we can attack Midway without any difficulties. So they get back to their aircraft carriers and they refuel their planes, and they decide to switch their bombs for torpedoes. So they're not going to have the bombs for bombing Midway anymore on the planes. They're going to put torpedoes on their planes so that they can attack the American ships. In the process of refueling and rearming their planes, so they have all their planes, all their bombs, all their torpedoes, and all of their fuel on board their aircraft carriers, America had already sent their planes to meet the Japanese fleet and to attack the aircraft carriers and the fleet. Almost immediately, 3 out of the 4 aircraft carriers are sunk and set ablaze, and the last carrier is severely damaged. So basically, the Japanese fleet is crippled, and this is a huge victory for the United States and will be the turn of the tide of the war in the Pacific. The tactic now used by the United States will be what we call island hopping. We can see on this map all of the areas in green are the areas controlled by the Japanese at this moment. So the Japanese took the Philippines, Indonesia, Southeast Asia, New Guinea, parts of New Guinea, the Solomon Islands, Guadalcanal, and a large portion of China is under their control. So the U.S. And international allied forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur, he is the famous Army general that is in command in the Pacific, and the Admiral Chester Nimitz, who is in charge of the Pacific Fleet. They decide that they're going to try to start taking back island by island until they can get close enough to Japan to attack the mainland. They can't leave Japanese on any islands nearby because then the Japanese will attack them from those islands. So they need to work their way slowly, island by island, back to Japan. The first major battles in this island hopping campaign are going to be here at Guadalcanal and the battle for the Solomon Islands. So these tiny little islands are here. We'll see huge campaigns and the loss of lots and lots of lives, both on the sides of the American forces and of the Japanese. The island hopping campaign was in the end successful, but it was very costly, both with regard to time, because it was very slow, and with regard to lives. The Americans were not used to fighting and living in the jungles, The Japanese were already dug in these islands. They had the advantage because the Americans were always the ones attacking the island and the Japanese were the ones defending it. So they were going against higher odds, and so it was a very difficult method, although successful. Eventually they were able to get close enough to Japan, mainly with the last major battle at Okinawa, which will be very famous. And they were able to get close enough to directly attack Japan. But it was a very costly campaign, and it will be one of the reasons why the United States will choose to use the atomic bomb against Japan. And I will leave you with this first part with the Battle of Leyte Gulf and pick up the next part with the part 2 video at Leyte Gulf.